Iron Line History. A Finnish military hospital. Spring 1944. A man is placed on the operating table. Or rather, what is left of him. A doctor holds 2 fingers against his wrist and watches the second hand move. In front of the medical team is frostbitten skin, rags where a uniform used to be, and a leg torn apart by an explosion. He weighs just 43 kilograms. But that is not what frightens the doctors most. It is his pulse. Around 200 beats per minute, while his body is lying still. His heart is hammering as if he is still running through deep snow. The doctors are stunned. This is not ordinary exhaustion. It is not ordinary frostbite. The young man's body is running at a speed that makes no sense, as if it has been driven through hell for days without stopping. He slips into delirium, comes back for a moment, then loses touch with reality again. The doctors understand that they are looking at something close to a biological anomaly, a soldier whose body has pushed beyond nearly every limit they know how to measure. His name was Aimo Koivunen. And the real question is not how the doctors managed to save him. The question is darker. How did an ordinary frontline scout end up on that table in the first place? The answer begins several days earlier, deep in the forests of Lapland, where a small tin box turned into a one-way ticket. March 1944, Finnish Lapland. A reconnaissance patrol is returning from a mission when a Soviet unit cuts across its path from the forest. A short exchange of fire, an order to pull back. Then a desperate chase begins. Skis slice through wet spring snow. Branches slap the men in the face. Behind them, between the fir trees, the shapes of the pursuers appear and disappear. At the front is Corporal Aimo Koivunen. He is 26 years old. In a ski patrol, the man in front has the filthiest job. He breaks the trail through untouched snow, so the others can move at all. Sweat soaks the back of his snow camouflage, then freezes into a crust in the cold. The air burns his lungs. His mouth tastes of blood. Aimo knows that if this continues for another minute, he will collapse face first into the snow. The patrol cannot leave him. If he falls, the whole group may be trapped. Then he remembers the pocket of his jacket. Inside is a flat metal box, a military stimulant issued for the most extreme situations. Pervitin, German methamphetamine. For Finnish soldiers, these tablets did not feel like an illegal drug. They felt more like brutal, military-grade coffee, a harsh tool for a harsh front. The instruction was simple. Take 1 tablet. But try doing that while running, in thick wool mittens, stiff with moisture and cold. His fingers will not obey. The lid comes off too sharply, and the little white pills spill into his palm. There is no time to count them. Behind him is the chase. Ahead of him is the darkening forest. Koivunen sweeps the pills into his mouth. It was the whole patrol's supply for about a week, roughly 30 tablets. In many retellings of the story, the dose is estimated at about 300 milligrams of the substance, a dose that could have stopped his heart in the first minutes. But the opposite happened. Within minutes, the exhaustion vanished, as if his body had been disconnected from the laws of physics. His legs carried him forward on their own. Aimo burst ahead with such force that he lost his own patrol. His commander shouted something after him, but the words no longer formed meaning. In his head, only one command remained: run. When his awareness partially returned, polar night had fallen around him. No enemies, no patrol, one man alone in an endless frozen emptiness. That was only the beginning of the nightmare. Pervitin shut down his sense of hunger and cold, but in exchange, it plunged Aimo's mind into a violent, continuous psychosis. For days he wandered, fleeing hallucinations, circling through tundra and forest. At one point, in a state of total delirium, he stumbled into an abandoned camp and stepped on an anti-personnel mine. The blast mangled his leg and destroyed his shelter. Crippled, starving, trapped in the cold, he kept fighting to stay alive, eating whatever he could find: snow, pine buds, small scraps of the forest. His body was literally borrowing from itself, squeezing out the last hidden reserves. That is why the hospital scene matters. It shows the end of that terrifying lone. Aimo Koivunen survived. Against medical logic, he pulled through, returned to civilian life, raised a large family, and lived to old age. But his case was an exception, almost a freak survival story. For millions of other soldiers in the Second World War, combat chemistry did not end with a rescue. It left behind a bill no one wanted to read: damaged minds, deep dependence, and a slow fading that could no longer be blamed on one insane march through the snow. That is the pattern we will follow: a short burst of borrowed strength, followed by a debt paid by the body long after the mission is over. So the story widens. Aimo's survival is the opening crack in a much larger wall. How did a small tablet, first made for tired civilians, become part of the military system? How did the armies of the Second World War begin to manage a soldier's rest, fear, and suffering almost as pragmatically as they managed fuel, ammunition, and marching time? To understand that shift, we have to leave the hospital and go back a few years. The story did not begin in a secret bunker. It began in plain sight, in pharmacies, kitchens, and magazine advertisements in pre-war Germany. There, a miracle pill for fatigue was sold as harmless help for housewives, drivers, and students. In late 1930s Germany, the idea of personal efficiency was everywhere: on a doctor's desk, in a student's briefcase, in the handbag of a telephone operator. The same object began to appear: a small package marked Pervitin. In 1938, the Berlin pharmaceutical company Temmler offered the nation what looked like the perfect drug for accelerated life. The new product, packaged in a recognizable blue and white tube, appeared in pharmacy windows and glossy magazines. Advertisements showed energetic, successful people. A smiling telephone operator could work all night without mistakes. A surgeon's hand would not tremble during a long operation. A long-distance driver could guide his truck through fog without fading. Pervitin was presented as a tool for extraordinary everyday performance, a key to a new, faster reality. The drug was called Pervitin, and it was not a secret weapon. It could be bought in almost any pharmacy, without a prescription, as easily as aspirin. The posters promised a small miracle. A tired housewife took a tablet and handled the day's chores with a smile. A student preparing for exams found intense concentration. A factory worker at the bench felt a surge of strength. The key word was Leistungssteigerung, increased performance. Pervitin drove away drowsiness and produced a feeling of euphoria, mental clarity, and absolute confidence. The manufacturers even released chocolates filled with methamphetamine so that housewives could perk themselves up during a coffee break. The tablets became a symbol of a modern, dynamic way of life. Dependence was not part of the sales pitch. Side effects were pushed out of sight. This was sold as a medicine of the new age, a product that was supposed to make the nation stronger and more productive. And this civilian drug, created to optimize peaceful labor, soon caught the attention of men in uniform. They saw in it the possibility of solving very different problems. How did this everyday medicine for fatigue become one of the key tools of the German military apparatus? The answer lies in the doctrine of the coming war. The German General Staff was betting on blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tank columns had to move day and night without stopping, breaking through enemy defenses and spreading chaos in the rear. The main limitation of this plan was not the engine. It was the human being. This is where Dr. Otto Ranke enters the story. He was director of the Institute of General and Defense Physiology. In his office, maps of military maneuvers sat beside charts of human endurance. To Ranke, the soldier was a biomechanical system whose efficiency could be measured and increased. He was interested in hours of wakefulness, reaction speed, and muscle tone after 48 hours without rest. He was looking for a chemical key that would let him control this mechanism the way an engineer controls an engine. Watching the popularity of Pervitin in civilian life, Ranke began his own experiments. He took the drug himself. Then he gave it to groups of students and forced them to solve difficult problems while extremely tired. The results were striking. The tiredness vanished. Concentration rose. The final stage was testing on young soldiers. They were made to march for days, almost without rest. Under the influence of Pervitin, they remained combat-capable. Ranke concluded that the drug could push back natural biological limits. In 1939, he presented his findings to the High Command. Soon, an official stimulant decree recommended Pervitin for fighting exhaustion among the troops. A civilian drug had now received a military address. By the spring of 1940, theory was waiting for a battlefield. That proving ground was France. In May 1940, the invasion began, and military theory turned into shocking reality. For this campaign, the German army and the Luftwaffe ordered more than 35 million tablets of Pervitin and its related compound, isophane. The size of the order made the intention clear. The drug was planned as a mass resource for units facing long marches, night raids, and extended flights. That astronomical number becomes a concrete scene at dawn near the French border. A medic with a large metal tin full of white tablets becomes as ordinary a part of the march preparation as filling fuel tanks. Tank crews, many of them very young, receive 2 or 3 tablets each. In their hands, the pills look official, almost like vitamins for wakefulness. They swallow them with water from a canteen and see the tablet as another piece of German technological power. The distribution of this new equipment becomes routine. Before a march that may last for days, a medic or officer moves along the formation and hands out tablets from a large tin. The instruction is brief: 1, to keep going, 2, if it gets really hard. In the ranks, the drug quickly gains nicknames. Tank crews call it Panzerschokolade, tank chocolate. Stuka dive bomber pilots call them Stuka tablets. The effect exceeds expectations. General Guderian's panzer divisions make an almost unthinkable drive through the Ardennes, covering hundreds of kilometers in 3 days with almost no real rest. They appear where Allied planners least expect them, bypass the famous Maginot Line, and strike into the rear of Allied armies. French and British commanders are stunned. They cannot understand how German troops are moving with such inhuman speed. The secret lay in tactics and chemistry at the same time. The Wehrmacht used pharmacology to interfere with the body's rhythm of rest and alertness. The image of the tireless German soldier became real on the roads of France. The Allies saw an enemy moving as if it had defeated nature itself. That meant they needed their own answer to the same question. How do you keep a pilot or navigator conscious when ordinary strength is gone? The Allied answer came, but by a different route. In Britain, and especially in the United States, another stimulant was already popular: Benzedrine. Like Pervitin, it had begun its public life in civilian medicine. From the 1930s, Benzedrine inhalers were sold in American pharmacies for colds and asthma. The side effect of wakefulness was well known. The remaining question was how to turn a pharmacy inhaler into a military tool. That side effect is exactly what attracted military doctors. Long patrol flights over the Atlantic and bombing raids deep into enemy territory demanded inhuman endurance from pilots and navigators. Exhaustion became a tactical enemy, causing navigation errors and crashes. Early experiments, conducted under strict secrecy, suggested that a Benzedrine tablet could delay the need for rest by 10 to 12 hours. It was exactly what they needed. But how could a medical drug become mass military equipment? When war became reality, American command faced a bureaucratic and ethical problem. How do you equip an army with a drug that many already considered narcotic? The solution was simple and disturbingly clever. Amphetamine stopped being treated as an ordinary medicine and was moved into the category of equipment. It became another item of kit, like a ration pack, a life vest, or a signal pistol. Instructions and packaging framed it as for emergency use during combat missions. The tablet left the doctor's office and entered the pilot's pocket, where only one result mattered: survive, reach the target, complete the order. That framing removed many objections. The psychological barrier was broken. The path to mass use was open. But how massive did it become? If the German program, with its 35 million tablets, seemed enormous, the American program simply dwarfed it. By conservative estimates, during the Second World War, more than 250 million doses of amphetamine were produced for the U.S. Army and Navy. Some historians put the number as high as 500 million. In theory, that would have been enough to supply the average American serviceman many times over. That giant number was the result of a well-tuned logistics system. Thousands of standard requisition forms are preserved in the U.S. National Archives. A company or squadron commander filled out a requisition for medical supplies, and on the same list as bandages and iodine appeared the line, amphetamine sulfate tablets. They were requested by the thousand. The tablets arrived in standard Army bottles of 1,000, then were distributed to individual medical kits or issued by non-commissioned officers before an operation. The bureaucracy worked smoothly. Amphetamine sulfate became a standard supply item. Field commanders could request it on ordinary forms, listing quantities alongside ammunition and fuel. This routine, everyday process stripped the tablets of their sinister aura. But mass availability had another effect. The system quickly began to leak. Pills that were supposed to be issued under specific conditions took on a life of their own. They became an unofficial currency on the soldiers' black market. They were traded for cigarettes, extra food, and gambling debts. The wakefulness pills, or go pills, as they came to be called, became part of military daily life, another way to get through the strain of service. Hundreds of millions of doses flowed across fronts from Europe to the Pacific. But what exactly did this small tablet do to a soldier's body? Contrary to a common idea, amphetamine does not contain energy the way sugar or coffee does. It does not fuel the muscles from the outside. It forces the body to spend its own reserves faster and harder than it would on its own. It is a key that opens the body's emergency stores before their time. Imagine your brain as a guarded warehouse of energy reserves. Neurotransmitters that support wakefulness and focus are released carefully, according to strict internal rules. Amphetamine works differently. It does not bring energy in from outside. Like a forged order, it forces the brain to throw open the emergency stores and release a huge part of its strategic reserve at once. It creates an artificial emergency mobilization. The body burns resources meant to last for days in order to deliver maximum performance here and now. But what happens between the nerve cells? Picture a synapse, the microscopic gap between two nerve cells. Under normal conditions, neurotransmitters such as dopamine and norepinephrine are released in measured amounts, regulating mood and focus. When an amphetamine molecule reaches the brain, it acts like both a lockpick and a battering ram. It enters nerve cells and triggers an avalanche-like release of stored chemicals. But how did this inner explosion feel to a soldier in a cockpit or a tank? The brain is flooded with dopamine, associated with motivation and reward, and norepinephrine, the fight-or-flight chemical that sharpens attention and mobilizes the body. A soldier feels a surge of strength, a clarity of thought, and an almost dangerous confidence. The danger has not disappeared, but the brain reads it differently, with less fear, more sharpness, and a false sense of control. This is where the central idea of our film appears, the biochemical loan. The army, like a bank, gives the soldier an instant loan of wakefulness, courage, and endurance. The asset, the completed mission, goes onto the state's balance sheet. A liability, the exhausted nervous system, stays on the soldier's personal account, and that loan will have to be repaid with enormous interest. But how did this borrowed energy help and harm soldiers in real combat? Nowhere was the double nature of amphetamines clearer than in the cockpit of a B-17 bomber flying a mission over Germany. 10 hours in an icy hell at 8,000 meters, the monotonous roar of engines, the tense wait for fighter attacks, oxygen deprivation. The pilot faced flak, enemy aircraft, and ordinary drowsiness. A momentary lapse at the controls could send the entire crew into disaster. Under these conditions, a Benzedrine tablet could feel like salvation. It drove away drowsiness, sharpened vision, and helped a man hold concentration for hours. The effect began after 20 or 30 minutes. The cold exhaustion gripping the body retreated. Vision sharpened. Instruments on the control panel seemed almost three-dimensional. Distant points in the sky became easier to identify as friend or enemy. A navigator could calculate a course for hours without losing the thread. Gunners could keep their eyes fixed on their sectors. It was a state of cold, synthetic clarity. The tablet made a human being into a more efficient part of the combat system, synchronizing his nervous system with the rhythm of the mission. But that same chemical surge had a darker side. The clarity that improved focus could also produce overconfidence and distort perception. A pilot under the influence of amphetamine might take unnecessary risks, drift from course, or enter combat on bad terms. Peripheral vision could create deceptions, phantom fighters, flashes that were not really there. A sharp maneuver in response to such a hallucination could break the tight formation of bombers and expose the whole squadron. The artificial clarity was fragile. It balanced on a thin line between improved performance and a dangerous warping of reality. But the hardest blow came later. When the pill wore off, the bill came due. The biochemical loan demanded repayment. This state was called a crash, a collapse of the nervous system. A soldier who had seemed almost superhuman the day before became a shadow of himself. His body shook with uncontrollable tremors. He could not hold a mug or a lighter steady. A mind that had been crystal clear sank into thick paranoia. Small noises sounded like enemy footsteps. Shadows became threats. The body that had borrowed from itself began to revolt. The hands shook so badly that lighting a cigarette became impossible. The heart pounded at a frantic rhythm. But the worst part happened inside the head. The world lost its clear edges and became a hostile kaleidoscope of shadows and sounds. A creaking door felt like a secret signal. A comrade's glance became an accusation. It was a collapse of the self, a fall into the well of paranoia. If doctors could see this fall, why did the supplies continue? The most frightening part is that military doctors were not surprised. In reports declassified after the war, the U.S. School of Aviation Medicine described the side effects directly. Researchers in white coats wrote with cold precision about cases of amphetamine psychosis, severe disorientation, and suicidal thoughts among pilots involved in experiments. The warning signs were there. The peak of superhuman efficiency could be followed by a plunge into mental chaos. Yet millions of doses still continued to reach the troops. That raises the central question. If Command had seen the price of this biological loan, why did it keep issuing it? And were stimulants the only chemical tool of that war? They were not. The film now moves from the cockpit and the tablet bottle to a very different frontline ritual. While German and American engineers of human performance relied on amphetamines, the Soviet Union used a different tool, far more widespread and, importantly, official: the famous People's Commissar's 100 grams. This policy was not spontaneous. It was a response to the catastrophic defeats of the summer of 1941, when the Red Army faced psychological pressure on a scale few armies could absorb. Soviet leadership needed a simple, scalable way to reinforce morale. Vodka, unlike complex amphetamines, was available and familiar. Anastas Mikoyan, the People's Commissar of the food industry, personally oversaw uninterrupted alcohol supplies to the front. A whole logistics system was created alongside ammunition supply, aimed at delivering a guaranteed dose of ethanol to soldiers at the front line. The vodka ration was legalized at the highest level by a State Defense Committee order dated August 22, 1941. The document prescribed 100 grams of vodka per day for frontline soldiers. Archive footage gives the ritual a texture: a field kitchen, steam rising from kettles in the frost, black bread in a mittened hand, a line of soldiers with mess tins and chipped mugs, and a sergeant ladling out the cloudy liquid with a measured motion. For millions of soldiers, this ritual became as much a part of frontline life as a bread ration or a letter from home. What did that daily ration mean when it was issued by the state? It was deliberate state policy, an attempt to use chemistry to solve two fundamental problems of war: fear and stress. But how did this official medicine for fear work in the real life of the trenches? The 100 grams had two main functions. The first was the chemical suppression of fear. Before an attack, when only minutes remained before men had to run toward enemy guns, vodka was supposed to remove the last psychological barrier. Picture the trench before dawn: mud on the boots, frost on the rifle bolts, a mug passed from hand to hand without jokes. Soldiers drank their dose in silence, and animal terror temporarily gave way to hot resolve or cold indifference. The mechanism was simple and harsh. Ethyl alcohol, quickly absorbed into the blood, suppresses the higher parts of the cerebral cortex, the regions involved in judgment, risk analysis, and self-preservation. The paralyzing grip of fear weakened. In place of icy terror came a blunt, heated courage. The world narrowed to a single point: the enemy trench. The sounds of battle became muffled, and a man's own life briefly lost value. It was a chemical way to push parts of the person into the background, leaving the function of a soldier moving forward. The second function came after battle. Then alcohol became medicine, a form of self-treatment for what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. In the dugout, after the roar stopped and the wounded had been carried away, men sat under a smoking lamp, scraping mud from their sleeves and trying not to look at the empty places beside them. Vodka helped silence the inner screams, blur the faces of dead comrades, and disappear for a few hours. The effect, however, was deeply ambiguous. Veterans' memories contradict one another. Some wrote that vodka reduced vigilance and led to needless losses. Others insisted just as strongly that without those 100 grams, it would have been impossible to survive, or to keep one's sanity in the hell of the front. Alcohol helped deal with psychological torment. Physical wounds required a different tool, one small enough to fit in a medic's pocket. The answer was morphine. Here, the Allied armies made a technological leap. Instead of fragile glass ampules that required a sterile syringe, the drug began to be issued in disposable syrettes, small metal tubes with a needle protected by a cap. This simple but brilliant invention allowed a medic, or even a wounded soldier himself, to inject the dose in the middle of combat without losing precious seconds. Developed by the company Squibb, this little tube, shaped almost like a miniature toothpaste tube, was a miracle of battlefield medicine. Inside was a standard dose, half a grain, or 32 milligrams. The sterile needle was already attached. A soldier or medic only had to remove the cap, push the needle into the wounded man's thigh or shoulder, even through clothing, and squeeze the contents in. It took seconds. For the first time in history, a powerful opiate was available for immediate use in the worst possible conditions. The protocol was strict and carefully designed. After injection, the empty syrette was supposed to be pinned to the wounded man's collar. That was a clear visual signal for the next doctor. A dose had already been given, and another injection could be fatal. But in the chaos of battle, under fire, in mud and blood, this simple protocol often broke down. A medic, trying to save a soldier, gave the injection and forgot the tube in the rush. An hour later, another medic saw the man suffering and gave another dose. The second dose could be the last. Good intentions and a thoughtful system collided with the brutal reality of the battlefield. What happens when stimulants, alcohol, and opiates are placed into one picture? Now the three lines converge into one system. On one front, a soldier is given a stimulant to postpone rest. On another, alcohol is used to dull fear. In hospitals and on the battlefield, an opiate is used to mute agony. Different substances solved different problems, but they served the same military calculation: manage the state of the human being as pragmatically as fuel, ammunition, or marching time. From this point on, we are no longer talking about separate drugs. We are talking about a new way of thinking about war, in which rest, fear, pain, memory, and endurance become manageable parameters. The human being is treated as a system that can be temporarily accelerated, dulled, anesthetized, and sent back to work. Random frontline habits become a technology of pharmacological control. In practice, this appears in one simple gesture: a soldier holding a tablet, a mug, or an ampule. What did this technology look like in everyday service? This toolkit was brutally pragmatic, and it was built into a soldier's daily life. A German tank crewman received a little metal container of Pervitin before a night march. An American pilot departing on a long mission found Benzedrine among the supplies in his kit. A Soviet infantryman, before an assault, watched the sergeant pour the famous 100 grams into mugs. Chemistry became another supply item, like cartridges or dry rations. And although alcohol was the Red Army's main chemical tool, it would be wrong to think Soviet forces saw no value in stimulants. In the individual kits of scouts, pilots, and sailors, one could find phenamine or caffeine tablets. Their use was not as total as in Germany or the United States, but the logic was the same. Squeeze the maximum possible performance from the human body in order to complete a combat mission. Here, as we see the three greatest military machines in the world and three hostile ideologies independently arriving at the idea of chemically enhancing the soldier, the main question becomes unavoidable. The private fate of one soldier leads us into the structure of a system that made such decisions normal. What did the high commands, German, American, Soviet, actually know about the consequences? About psychosis, dependence, exhaustion of the nervous system. How clearly did they see the price a human being would pay for the machine's temporary super-efficiency? And once the warnings appeared, why did the programs continue? The answer is simple and terrifying in its ordinariness. Enough was known to raise alarms. Military doctors in several armies wrote detailed reports. Luftwaffe physicians recorded cases of psychosis. American researchers openly used the phrase amphetamine psychosis to describe pilots. But those reports entered a system that judged risk through a very different lens. This knowledge was not locked away in some unreachable vault. It circulated through internal memos and restricted reports. Military doctors recorded the facts, but they wrapped them in a particular language. Instead of drug-induced psychosis, they wrote side effects requiring observation. Instead of dependence, they wrote the need to control distribution. On the desks of staff analysts lay tables, charts, and percentages of negative reactions. The fate of a specific human being dissolved into dehumanized statistics. How did such statistics become a command decision? It was military engineering logic, cold, rational calculation. Imagine scales in a staff office. On one side is the immediate, concrete benefit. A bomber crew that stays conscious and returns to base with an expensive aircraft. A tank battalion that completes a forced march and breaks open the front. A result that can be measured in kilometers, hours, and saved equipment. On the other side is delayed, abstract harm. The chance that one tank crewman will suffer a nervous collapse a year later. The risk that a pilot will develop dependence after the war. In a system where victory is needed here and now, the choice is already shaped. Mental disorders, ruined families, and addiction become statistical noise. Acceptable costs on the way to the objective. But how was this ruthless calculation presented to the soldier himself? The human being, his future, his private tragedy. All of it was pushed outside the equation. In its place came a cleaner word, necessity. This cynical calculation was dressed as institutional deception. First, soldiers were usually not told the full truth. They were not told about the risk of lasting psychological change, the formation of deep dependence, or the possibility that their brain's own reward system could be damaged for good. The truth was hidden and replaced with a convenient formula. A stimulant was presented as a vitamin for wakefulness or a fatigue pill, while its narcotic nature was left unsaid. Leaflets, when they existed, spoke about increased concentration and endurance. This was the language of efficiency and mechanics, not medicine. The drug was framed as a scientific achievement that allowed the body to work like a well-tuned motor. Second, the instructions that accompanied these drugs were purely utilitarian. Take one tablet to relieve fatigue. Nothing about complex neurochemistry. No warning about withdrawal. The tablet was presented as a simple tool, like a whetstone for a knife. What did the soldier himself hear when that tool was placed in his hand? That is why the next question becomes human. How was this calculation explained to the soldier, holding the tablet, the mug, or the ampoule? Then the war ended. The victory parades faded. The winners returned home. But for the chemical soldier, the real war, the quietest and most frightening one, was only beginning. Newsreels preserved the official image of victory. Ships arriving in New York Harbor. Trains being met with flowers at Belaruski Station. Smiling, slightly exhausted heroes returning from the front to build a new peaceful life. That image was not simply propaganda. It was real joy, real relief, and the hope of entire nations. But when the fireworks ended and the hero returned to a quiet apartment, his body still lived by the laws of war. An organism trained by constant chemical stimulation could not simply switch off combat mode. Nights became torture by insomnia. The silence of the peaceful city felt deafening and threatening. Hands used to weapons trembled for no obvious reason. The body demanded the familiar dose, whether amphetamine, alcohol, or morphine, just to feel normal. The celebrating world did not notice that inside yesterday's hero, a new invisible battle was unfolding. Behind the parade facade was another reality, almost invisible. Millions of men came home carrying more than scars. They returned with altered, rewired biochemistry. Over years of war, their nervous systems had been trained to rely on external regulators, chemical crutches that helped them stay alert, suppress fear, and stop feeling wounds. The army had issued them an enormous biochemical loan of wakefulness and courage. Now, in the deafening silence of civilian life, it was time to pay it back, with unbearable interest. But very few people had the language to describe that bill. This war was fought alone, behind closed bedroom and kitchen doors, deep inside the minds of former soldiers. How did this invisible chemical trauma appear in millions of post-war lives? And why were society and medicine so blind to it? Post-war health systems, both in the Soviet Union and the United States, were prepared for tragedy they could see. Doctors knew how to treat bullet wounds and shrapnel wounds, amputations, burns, and concussions. The hospital was a place where the body was repaired. But what do you do when the wound is invisible? When it's rooted in the chemistry of the brain itself? Look at a typical veteran's medical file from those years. On the doctor's desk are x-rays, operation reports, rehabilitation notes. There are burns, amputations, concussions. There is no box marked systematic stimulant use under military orders. Military medicine solved the tactical problem. Civilian medicine treated visible wounds. The pharmacological intervention fell into the empty space between the two systems. What did a doctor see when such a man sat down across from him? Imagine a veteran in a doctor's office. He complains of insomnia, shaking hands, constant anxiety, without a clear cause. He does not tell the doctor that for years he took powerful stimulants under orders. He may not even consider it important. It was equipment. The doctor, for his part, may have no real understanding of the scale of the Army's pharmacological program. He sees a man with shattered nerves and gives a diagnosis typical of the time: war neurosis, neurasthenia, fatigue syndrome. What changes when a physiological problem is described in moral language? A dangerous substitution takes place. A physiological problem caused by chemical intervention is translated into psychology and morality. It becomes personal weakness or difficulty adapting to civilian life. The system that created the problem washes its hands of it, turning it into the private burden of the soldier. He is prescribed a sedative or told to pull himself together. For a brain trained on powerful surges of dopamine, that advice is like trying to patch a hole in a dam with a bandage. In this way, millions of invisible injuries were simply erased from the medical history of the victorious generation. But what happened to those who could no longer live without their chemical crutches? The consequences depended on the substance. For American veterans accustomed to Benzedrine, the problem did not vanish. It merely changed scenery. Amphetamines were legal and widely available in pharmacies as weight loss aids or treatments for low mood. The circle of dependence closed. A habit formed in war found support in civilian life. Post-war America was in love with scientific progress. Amphetamine inhalers were sold without a prescription. Tablets were marketed as miracle slimming aids for housewives or as stimulants for students. A veteran returning home entered a world where his battlefield doping had become an ordinary consumer product. A habit formed in the cockpit of a bomber found an easy, socially approved continuation on the shelf of the nearest pharmacy, making the biochemical loan almost permanent. One of the most frightening scenarios unfolded in post-war Japan. Enormous military stockpiles of methamphetamine, known under the brand name Hiropon, entered the black market after surrender. A country humiliated by defeat and exhausted by hunger suddenly had access to a cheap, powerful euphoric drug. The result is often described as one of the first large-scale methamphetamine epidemics in modern history. Whole neighborhoods of pompists appeared, people living from injection to injection. Police raids, underground laboratories, thousands of broken lives. This was the price Japan paid for the attempt to create the hyper-awake soldier. At the same time, a quieter tragedy played out elsewhere, the fate of the badly wounded across many armies. A soldier who lost a leg at the front might receive morphine in the hospital for months to survive unbearable agony. The medicine saved him from agony, but in return, it could capture his nervous system. This is called iatrogenic dependence, dependence caused by treatment itself. Yesterday's hero, trapped in a hospital bed, became a man whose well-being depended entirely on the next injection. His war against suffering did not end with the last shot. Stimulants, opiates. But what about the most widespread drug issued to Red Army soldiers? For the Soviet veteran, the main chemical anchor was alcohol. During the war, his nervous system had learned a simple rule: fear, cold, and extreme stress can be silenced with a portion of vodka. The People's Commissar's 100 grams had been an official mechanism for managing the soldier's state. This chemical tool helped men go into attacks and allowed them to dull, for a few hours, what they had seen after battle. The mechanism worked reliably, forming a conditioned reflex at the level of physiology. The state regularly supplied a substance that chemically suppressed the activity of the amygdala, the part of the brain involved in fear. A durable association formed: tension, the sight of death, cold earth underfoot, then rapid relief after a dose of ethanol. The army trained the soldier's brain to seek rescue in the bottle. What happened when the war ended, but that conditioned reflex remained? The war is over. The soldier returns home, but the stress has not vanished. Memories, wounds, the difficulties of civilian life, all of it continues pressing on the mind. The official medicine is gone. No sergeant pours the assigned dose before the next battle with reality, and the man, trained by the army to use a simple solution, begins to apply it on his own. The empty space left by the frontline 100 grams is filled by the bottle on the kitchen table. The high level of alcoholism among frontline veterans, which became a serious social problem in the post-war Soviet Union, was not simply a story of moral decline. In many cases, it was a story of desperate self-treatment. It was a direct legacy of a war that taught millions of people a simple answer to unbearable questions, an answer that kept destroying them after peace returned. 3 armies, 3 substances, 3 similar tragedies. It would seem the lesson should have been learned. It was not. The reason is simple. From the viewpoint of the military machine, the engineering approach to the human being had worked frighteningly well. Guderian's tanks really did reach the English Channel without proper sleep. American bombers really did avoid some crashes caused by exhausted crews. Short-term tactical benefit outweighed long-term human damage. This logic was built into the structure of military planning. For a staff officer, the effect was visible and measurable. In reports, it appeared as fewer pilot errors or greater range for reconnaissance missions. The chemical soldier became an element of tactical advantage. The long-term consequences, dependence, psychosis, ruined lives, stayed outside the frame. They were a problem for another department, for veterans' hospitals, for the future. Where did this logic appear again? And so the system reproduced itself. During the Korean War, American pilots again received amphetamines. In Vietnam, stimulant use became routine in some contexts. The so-called go pills, Benzedrine tablets, a powerful amphetamine, were included in the kits of reconnaissance teams heading into the jungle for multi-day patrols. The instruction was simple: 1 tablet every 12 hours to maintain alertness. The line of continuity is difficult to ignore. From Pervitin and Wehrmacht tanks to Benzedrine in the rucksacks of American infantrymen in Vietnam. And the notorious heroin epidemic that swept through U.S. forces in Vietnam did not appear from nowhere. It landed on prepared ground. A military mindset in which the soldier had already been taught by the army itself to solve human limits with a pill. First, to avoid sleep. Then, to suppress fear. Then, to forget what he had seen. That was decades ago. Surely today, in the age of high technology, things have changed. They have, and they have not. The principle remains the same, but the tools are more refined. Crude amphetamines have given way to a new generation of drugs. The best known is modafinil. Under controlled conditions, it can help pilots and special operators stay awake for extended periods, while preserving cognitive function and avoiding the severe crash associated with earlier stimulants. Tank chocolate has been replaced by a more precise neurochemical instrument. That instrument is already part of routine. Picture a drone operator at a base in Nevada. His shift is 12 hours of continuous surveillance over a target on another continent. Beside his keyboard is a thermos of coffee and a package of medication issued by prescription. On his body are biometric sensors transmitting real-time data about heart rate, stress level, and concentration. The system does not wait for the human to become tired. It predicts and corrects his state. But that is only the visible edge of the iceberg. Research agencies such as DARPA have explored programs that sound like science fiction. Their goal is a more resilient, more metabolically dominant soldier, a human being able to function with less food and sleep, whose pain and fear can be managed at the biochemical level. The person risks being treated less as a whole human being and more as an operator, a component of a weapons system, something to be optimized alongside the engine of a tank. The chemical soldier of the Second World War was a crude prototype. Today, the idea has evolved into the bioengineered operator of the 21st century. The technologies are subtler, the risks are less obvious, but the fundamental question has not changed. Who pays the bill for this efficiency? The answer is simple. The entire history of the chemical soldier is the history of a vast biochemical loan. Armies, states, and systems issued that loan to their soldiers. A loan of wakefulness, so a man could attack without sleep. A loan of courage, so he could look death in the face. A loan of relief, so he could stop feeling his wounds. The moment the loan is issued is not an abstract financial operation. It is a concrete physical act. A medic moving along the trenches before a dawn attack, handing out tablets from a metal box. A pilot taking a dose before a long night mission. An ampule lying on the table beside a trembling hand, minutes before the man has to go back to work. In that moment, an unspoken contract is made. The system gives the soldier temporary chemical strength so he can obey the order. And he, often without understanding it, signs up for an obligation he may spend decades repaying. What does the system record as its asset? The system received its asset. A battle won, a mission completed, a bomber saved from crashing, a tactical advantage measured in captured kilometers and destroyed targets. That asset was immediately written onto the state's balance sheet and entered into the history books. And the liability? The liability was built from exhausted nervous systems, dependence, anxiety disorders, broken families, and shattered lives. It was written entirely onto the soldier's personal account. The loan was issued by an impersonal military apparatus. It had to be repaid by a specific human being, alone, in the silence of post-war life, after the parades had faded and he had almost been forgotten. That gap between the one who receives the benefit and the one who carries the cost is the essence of this tragedy. In the end, this is a story about a tragic gap. The gap between the goals of a system and the fate of a human being. Every system, military, state, corporate, seeks efficiency. It measures success in clear, countable units. Kilometers advanced, tons transported, tactical victories. In that logic, a person becomes a resource, a functional element. Look at these artifacts: a rusted Pervitin tin, a cardboard inhaler, an ampule. For military logistics, these were consumables, standing in the same row as cartridges, bandages, and fuel. Their use was planned in headquarters. They were entered into records as special supplies. Quartermasters calculated the required number of doses per division per day of advance. Human endurance and fear became supply categories. Private tragedy dissolved into the impersonal bureaucracy of army accounting. But the price of this systemic efficiency is always measured in other units, invisible, uncountable units of human suffering. Years of insomnia, panic attacks, trembling hands that cannot hold a cup, broken relationships, lives lived in the shadow of chemical trauma. These units do not appear in generals' reports or victory communiques. That is why the story of the chemical soldier remained on the margins of memory for so long. It interferes with the simple heroic story of war. In it, courage stands beside the tablet. Endurance stands beside the frontline dose. The order stands beside consequences no one wanted to ask about. This perspective does not erase soldiers' courage. It makes the price of that courage more accurate and more human. Complicated and uncomfortable stories like this require an honest conversation. They matter because behind every major historical event stand personal, often untold stories. Every victory has its price, and sometimes that price is almost invisible. The history of the chemical soldier shows how the state apparatus treats the human being at the moment of extreme pressure. It forces us to look again at heroism, willpower, and the results for which people are asked to give more than they can bear without breaking. Stories like this strip the past of convenient pathos and leave us with a difficult question. Where is the line between necessary sacrifice and an unacceptable price? If you believe the human truth of war deserves to be remembered, support our work. Subscribe, leave a comment, and tell us which hidden chapter of military history we should investigate next. It tells us that stories like this are needed. Stories that do not fit inside the parade myth, but are too important to disappear. Thank you for watching.